But first up, here is Andrea Williams from Christian Concern, CEO. And I usually call you a soldier for Christ, but actually, I think it's more of a ministry, isn't it? Christian Concern.
Yes, it is. It is absolutely it is, and we've been around now for 20 years in the UK, and I was qualified as a barrister back in 1988. So I
Wow.
have been on the scene
I don't know
for a
how that's
very
possible, Andrea.
for a very long time. It's definitely possible, but it's been important in the United Kingdom to really contend in the law, in Parliament, in cases and also to seek to awaken the church to what it is that's going on. So, really, I've spent most of my life trying to do that since really the late 1980s and into the 90s, when I began to see that the human rights system of law, which was replacing our common law system,
Mm.
was going to lead to a situation whereby people will get into trouble simply for the expression of the Christian faith in public life. And indeed, that's what we have seen happen. But not even I could have imagined at the time, in the 1990s, that we would see the volume of cases that we have and the kind of issues that we've got day in, day out now here in the United Kingdom.
Well, it was quite prophetic, I suppose, but not necessarily in a good way, because we are going through major trials and tribulations as a nation, aren't we? I've personally been helped by Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre a couple of times, and a number of my friends have. But it seems to me every week now there's a story or there's a case that's being highlighted. There are things that we need to expose in the open because the darkness is heavy and it's got a grasp over our lands, and we are fighting back. And you are one of the few people out there publicly fighting back. So I thank you for that. And so I invited you on today because I want to go through some of the cases that you're working on because there's so much that
Yeah.
Christian Concern is doing. And Jennifer Melly is one of the most recent cases that we talked about on this show, in that this was a lady who, I was going to say is, but was working for the NHS. And she was dealing with a patient, a difficult patient, as often happens. And I think she misgendered him, is the terminology. She called a man, which I would say is just being honest, but she misgendered him. And he assaulted her with verbal abuse, of racial abuse, of which she's supposed to just put up with, or if it is addressed, it will be in the distant future. But she has now been suspended. What's the update on that?
Yes, I mean it is quite it's quite an extraordinary situation, and I think that as we were saying just then, how did it come? How did it come? How did it really come to this? I talked about going back right to the 1980s,
Mm.
and I think that in the 1980s it would have seemed impossible to think that in this country, in the United Kingdom, for instance, you would be able to rewrite your birth certificate to say, as a man, you're a woman, and that to be recognised in law. We weren't thinking at all of things such as same-sex marriage back in the 1980s. That would have seemed an impossible notion, and I think that we've got to remember that when we come to think about the kind of things that we deal with day in, day out, and the kind of things that people get into trouble for, because it's a relatively short period of time.
Well, in the
Uh,
70s, Andrea, this was a Monty Python sketch, wasn't it? In the line for Brian, when was it Loretta who wanted
yeah,
to have the right to have a baby, although he understood living as a woman he wouldn't be able to have a baby, but he wanted to have the right to want to have a baby. It's like it was so insane. They made jokes about it.
well, the truth is now, of course, that a woman who gives birth can become a legal man and has argued to be named as the father on the birth certificate and for the partner to be the mother. This is not, this isn't Monty Python and it's not legal fiction. It's legal reality. These things are being argued in the English courts. We are put to proof even on what the Church of England's teaching is on male and female, on gender, as if because the voice of the church in the United Kingdom has become so unclear on this. So we've had documents used against us in one of our older cases, the case of Dr. Makareth, and this kind of plays into this Jennifer Meller case, the case of Dr. Makareth, where a doctor who'd been an emergency doctor for 40 years with the NHS, was doing a government job with the Department for Work and Pensions, and it was an assessment job. And he said that he wouldn't be able to put on a medical assessment form that a man was a woman or a woman was a man because that was biologically, medically incorrect.
Right.
And he was said, well, what if a 6'2" man came in and said they were a woman? He was literally asked this question. And would you be able to say that man was a woman? And he said that he wouldn't be able to say that, and he was suspended and lost his job. But that was a fit. That was he was suspended for something that was a hypothetical scenario. Fast forward 5 or 6 years, and we have a real life scenario of Jennifer Melley. Jennifer Melley doing her dream job, um, been in the country for 14 years, if I remember correctly, really the loves the National Health Service, loves being in the United Kingdom, couldn't speak more highly of it, working a night shift. And it's sort of middle evening. There's a man who's from the local prison. He's convicted of he's a known in the hospital. He's a convicted paedophile. He comes in shackled by two prisoners, arms and legs, and she refers to him by the name that he wants to be, the female name that he asks to be called. He's in a side room. He overhears Jennifer speaking about him to the consultant doctor, about him as a her.
Oh, so that's even worse. So, I mean, so much of that is even worse. Like, the fact that he's a
Yeah,
convicted paedophile, he's shackled up with two guards, but the fact that he overheard her referring to him in the third person, because that's what a lot of this is about. People say you must use my preferred pronouns, but people aren't usually around when you're using their third person pronouns because you're talking about them. You don't talk about someone in front of them, and so
that's
it's
it.
kind of projecting your ideology onto someone. I was
And
thinking about this yesterday. I happen to be a Christian priest. Now, we call Christian priests reverend or father or pastor. Now, if someone's not a Christian, I wouldn't expect them to call me Pastor Robinson or Father Robinson or vicar because it's not part of their worldview. It's not part of,
yeah,
and I wouldn't force my worldview onto them. However, the trans ideology does just that. It says even when I'm not with you, you must refer to me based on my belief structure. That's weird.
exactly. Exactly. She didn't know that he had overheard. She was dealing with reality. She was dealing with biology. She was dealing with the medical situation that this person was in. She was being kind to him. In fact, he was agitated. She was trying to settle him.
Yeah.
And he came after her. He started dragging the guards with him, came after her, and came right up close to her so that she was shaking and called her the N word. So he was at her in her face. Um, the situation then calmed down, and she helped to calm it down. And she was kind, and she went on looking after him. But he then put in a complaint when she was on the bus going home. That night, on the bus going home, she got a call from someone within the hospital, not so much to ask after her, but to ask what had happened.
Right. In a sane world, she would get a call from her superior to say, "Well done today. You were up against it. I'm sorry you went through that. First and foremost, I'm sorry you had to be dealing with, a convicted paedophile. It's not an easy thing to do. You're a professional. Well done. He verbally abused you, racially abused you. Congratulations on handling it, calming down the situation. We'll take it from here. Are you okay? Would you like a day off? Comfort day." That in an ideal world, that would be what happened. But what actually happened?
Well, she was suspended. She then was she was then we managed to get her then put into a different part of the she wasn't allowed to go back onto the ward that she wanted to. She wasn't allowed to do the extra shifts. So she's a single mum. She really loved doing the extra shift so that she could um, really feed her family.
Right.
She's got children that she's looking after. She was desperate to be able to access these extra shifts. She's a really lovely lady. Um, we managed to get her reinstated into a different part of the hospital,
Right.
but then, as a result of telling her story to the press, she was suspended again without warning.
Because we know that actually what the NHS cares most about, even more than patients, is its image, isn't it? There's another story you and I will hopefully get to talk about a little bit later, in that the NHS puts these gagging orders on people, and the court backs the NHS up consistently. So
Well,
the
I think
NHS cares more about image.
well, I think that this is one of the really important things to remember generally in part of all of these processes is the fear that the authorities put into ordinary folk, ordinary, really great folk,
Yeah.
that are just working and feeding their families. So within the hospitals, there suddenly becomes a gagging order on Jennifer. She's not allowed to talk about this to anyone. Well, certainly not to the media,
Mm.
not to anybody in the hospital. So they come in and they, by the way, they weren't specific about not talking to the media, but when she did, they came in after that. But that's the kind of thing you get. And then the whole hospital, essentially, they get the workers get issued a memo not to speak about this with anyone or to one another about it. And we've seen that in the Darlington nurses case, which of
Yeah.
course is a similar case to this, where nurses, again, for telling their story to the press of being forced to accept that a man who identifies as a woman is a woman in their changing room, and essentially to comply with that. The NHS doesn't change its policy, but actually tells its staff not to speak about the matter to anyone. And so what happens then? The staff get scared, people get scared. And I think, Calvin, that one of the very interesting things in this line of work, and I think that you will have found it for yourself as well, is that how intimidated people are, how much people are put into fear
Oh yeah.
for simply speaking the truth out about their situations.
Yes, there is a lot of fear, and unfortunately, you don't know how it's going to affect you until it happens to you. And people think that they will be firm, but you lose friends because people will not stand up for you. And I'm great to see that Christian Concern, I'm pleased to see Christian Concern is backing this lady, but I imagine many of her friends and colleagues will have backed away and gone silent because they too are fearing for their jobs and their livelihoods, which is an understandable thing. But I imagine she's feeling quite on her own right now, and that's part of this. That's part of what the establishment does. It makes you feel isolated, unfortunately.
That's it, and that's why it's people. That's why it's really important that you continue. For instance, that you are here unashamed and unafraid, and we at Christian Concern are here unashamed and unafraid, and we have to build a movement of people that says that no matter how much we are intimidated,
Yes.
no matter how much people tell us to be quiet and to be silent, we won't be scared and we won't be intimidated, and we will stand and we will stand with those that get into trouble for speaking out truth.
Because there's power in numbers, and I often say if we all stick our heads above the parapets, they can't chop all our heads off.
That's it.
But it takes a bit of courage.
It
And if
does.
people feel like, well, I don't have courage, you don't have to have courage. Rely on Him, rely on your Lord. He will give you the courage you need. Now, you've
Yes.
had a win. We have to celebrate these wins because they're
Yes,
few
we
and
do
far
have
between these
wins. We
days.
do actually have, and quite a lot of wins that there are quite a few wins just because we help people day in, day out,
Yeah.
writing letters, pushing back, um, saying that we are free to do this. You can't suspend me for this, or you can't stop me from saying this, or we are able to go and preach in the streets, or whatever it might be. We This happens a lot.
Right, so let's talk about this street preacher who,
Yes.
well, the Labour Council in particular, in Rushmore Borough, wanted to ban street preachers because they thought it was intimidating to people. It caused offence and alarm and distress to passers-by. Now, street preaching is one of the oldest traditions in our country. It's been a Christian country since England was actually a country, and people have always been out on the streets preaching because we're all called to proclaim the Lord and to spread the gospel. So to ban street preaching isn't just an offense against free speech, it's an offense against the state's religion, the country's religion. However, this was a win because the Labour-run council has U-turned on this thanks to public pressure.
Yeah, that this is an absolutely fabulous win. I mean, the history on these cases is again goes back 20 years, but before what was happening is that street preachers were being arrested on the streets under sort of public order type offences. So accused of causing harassment, alarm, distress. And what we have done time and again at the Christian Legal Centre with 100% success rate, and we have represented hundreds of street preachers.
Mm.
Sometimes we win on appeal, but we have managed to keep the streets open for the street preacher. And it's been a really important battle to win because imagine if we hadn't been there. Imagine if we hadn't been there in the year 2000. What would preaching in the churches be criminalized? Would
Right.
that be being policed at this point? It's been really important as a principle, but it's shifted recently. What's happened is there's been a shift, not so much of the arrest, but rather these preemptive injunctions that say you can't go into this particular location
Mm.
and preach. You can't sing. You can't use a banner. You can't give food with tracts. You can't give out Bibles. This was There was a ban on distributing Bibles, a ban on distributing religious literature. So there's a ban on singing, a ban on amplification. And it basically, but the thing that happened here was that it was so draconian that the Labour Council was asked, well, is carol singing going to be under this injunction? Will carol singing be banned? And when they were confronted with the sort of general furore of their overreach, they backed down. And let me say that another reason why they backed down was in fact because the churches in this particular location, in and around Rushmore, Aldershot, Fareham, the churches also had a good reputation. So the council had put in this injunction, but the truth was that when confronted with the good work of what the churches were doing and how unified, this was an example, Calvin, of where the churches got together
Mm.
and where they came and said, this will affect us all. It's not just the street preacher over there, the kind of one that the police might arrest. We won't even be able to do carol singing.
Yeah.
And the other good thing about this particular case, and again, this is a message for us all, was that on the council, in fact, were councillors that were Christians that hadn't realised the extent of this injunction. And so they, at that point, didn't um, didn't bow, didn't yield.
Mm.
They strongly made the case for why there should be a U-turn. And this is in the real importance of Christians and people with common sense, people who believe in free speech, being involved at a local level in these kind of institutions and really speaking up and speaking out because you can really shape local life when you're involved in these sorts of things. So that was great to have that win. But of course, as you all know, Calvin, that these sorts of injunctions are being used in all kinds of places. And who would have imagined that in the United Kingdom there would be places today where people cannot go to pray, cannot go and speak to people? That's the truth.
It's a sorry state of affairs.
Thank you for watching my Common Sense Crusade. If you'd like to watch the whole show, you can subscribe to lotuseaters.com for as little as £5 per month, and then you get access to a bank of content as well. My show is 3 p.m. every Thursday. See you there. Deus Vult.